Hello, Jim. Thanks very much for joining me again on the show.
Hey, Carl, thanks again for having me. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's been a few months since we spoke, and I know you've had a really busy summer. For a lot of people in Europe and I suppose parts of North America, it's the end of one season, Jim, and a chance to reflect. What thoughts would you have on the best way of reflecting on the season that you've just had in terms of your golf?
Well, I think a lot of it comes down to, did you have a plan at the start of the season? And in general, I think most amateur golfers lack an overall strategic plan for how to get better. It's sort of a hit or miss approach. But for the really serious golfers who are sort of doing their homework, they should have come up with a plan. Like if your index is say a 10, you could set a goal that by the end of the season, generally here in the northern hemisphere of the States, the people stop posting scores for handicap purposes around November 1st, November 15th, and they start up again like mid-March, early April. So if your goal was to go from a 10 to a 5, that would be an overarching goal. Then the question is, what's the strategy to get you there? Which means, what have you identified specific weak areas in your game? Did you address those areas with a plan in terms of practice or instruction or both? I think that's what people need to do, is kind of look back and see, did I carry out my strategy, or did I fail to carry it out? Yeah.
And do you think it's a good idea to really drill down into specific skills that you perhaps need to work on? So
Yeah.
just off the top of my head, pace putting, for instance, or just to drill a bit deeper than I'm just going to work on my game.
Yeah, you need to know what your weak areas, what areas in the four main skill areas, which of the four skill areas are you weakest in, which are mental game, long game, short game, putting game. And that's what I always ask my students to do. Just review which of those four areas are costing you the most strokes, and then really dial in on that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's a good time of year, isn't it, Jim, to look back on your experiences over the previous season and maybe ask a few deeper questions. I know we've talked in the past about purpose. What are your thoughts on the importance of getting real clarity on the reason why you do this thing, the purpose for playing the game?
That's such a great question. I think it's one of the big overarching principles that you need to identify why you're doing it. And unfortunately, because of the nature of golf and the nature of the human mind, it's easy to get bogged down in just what I'll call negative reasons for playing the game, negative purposes.
Yeah.
So, for example, the big one would be purely for ego enhancement. That's almost always a recipe for disaster, because I think if the main reason you're playing is to enhance your ego, unless you're already a very, very good player, like zero handicap or better, the game will just beat you up. The game itself is so inherently difficult. It's just hard on the human ego. Every aspect of it is difficult. So to me, you have to play, if you want to have a healthy relationship with the game, it has to transcend anything that's mostly based on ego gratification. There has to be a larger purpose. There's a term in Japanese culture, particularly in Japanese martial arts, which is called kaizen, which basically translates to mastery in English. There's actually a interesting guy named, I forget his first name, his last name is Denham, who was a corporate management consultant, who was the traditional corporate management guy until he happened to go to Japan on a sabbatical. And he fell in love with Japanese culture, particularly with Zen Buddhism and the idea of kaizen. So he's written books, and which changed for the better, a lot of American corporate culture based on the idea of mastery, which is mainly about long-term improvement, not so much about short-term improvement. Yeah, so I think that's part of it. Adopting a mastery philosophy. I would start there, and then the second thing would be, in my research, I've identified three main types of, I call them the golfing personality types, which are learner, competitor, and shot maker.
Right.
And everybody has all three aspects. Every serious golfer, everyone who loves golf has, to some degree, all three. But the question is, to what degree are you one versus the other, right? So for me, speaking for myself, I've always been a shot maker, which means the reason I play the game, especially now with the twilight of my career as a player. It's age 73. It's not so much about the score. I like hitting quality golf shots, which is why I like to, if I had the choice between spending 5 hours on the practice range versus 5 hours on the golf course, unless it was a course a really good course that I'd never played before, I would choose the 5 hours on the range.
Really?
Because I like to hit the shots.
You just get so
golf,
much pleasure. You get so much pleasure from producing golf shots.
Yeah, yeah. Tiger's a shot maker personality. His high school golf coach, I always joke, it was one of the greatest book titles in the history of publishing. The name of the book was Tiger Woods Made Me Look Like a Genius, because he was like a typical high school golf coach, often a typical high school golf coach, at least in America. I don't know about the UK. They're generally not good players, but they're teachers who happen to like golf. So they might be like a 15, 20 handicap, which was the case with this guy that was coaching Tiger in high school. But he said in one of the early chapters of the book that Tiger they would meet after school at 3:30 and they would hit balls for like 30 minutes and then they go play 9 holes in threesomes. He goes, and 90% of the time I'd be out there on the golf course watching these guys play to give them feedback. And Tiger's group would only have 2 people, and he would ask these other kids what happened to Tiger, and he goes, "Oh, he badly mishit a shot on the first 2 holes, so he went back to the range to work it out." So he would be back on the driving range.
Right.
But Hogan was a shot maker too. Hogan cared about the quality, the sound of impact, the feeling of solid contact, and of course, watching the ball fly in the air on line with your chosen target. That's why a shot maker plays, not so much the score. The competitor doesn't care how he shoots a low score. A competitor personality only cares about shooting as low as possible on any given day. So they don't care how they do it. There's a term, at least in the States, we call it playing ugly.
Yeah, winning ugly.
Win ugly. As long as they're winning by playing ugly, that's all. It doesn't matter how they do it, right? So those are competitors. And then learners are people who enjoy the process of learning new information, internalizing new information, forming new physical movement patterns, new skills. They enjoy the interaction with the coach. They enjoy going online and reading things about the golf swing or about the mental game or about putting or short game. So that's why they play. So that when I work with a new student, I ask a series of questions to try to determine which one of those 3 they are. Right. And then once you know that, it makes it a little easier to follow strategy.
And that's fascinating, Jim. So then once you establish which of those 3 they tend towards, would you then try and create some balance by bringing some of the other elements in there within the coaching?
Yeah, correct. Because obviously score, man, nobody, even the most extreme shot maker or learner, is still going to be upset if they shoot a particularly high score.
Yeah.
Right. So scoring always does matter. Right. So that's one of the things you have to keep in balance. And usually for the competitors, it's getting them to not be so ego attached to score, and to try to find more pleasure in the quality of the shot or in the quality of the light bulb moment that you have as a learner. Right. You know, my company is called Balance Point for a reason. It has multi-dimensional meanings, but that's one of them, avoiding extremes, finding the Buddhist idea, finding the middle way. So I love that. I love your question about balancing it out. Exactly right. Yeah.
Because I can think of a few players there who probably, as they reflect on their career, have been immensely gifted ball strikers, but probably to the detriment of the competitiveness, in the sense that it's almost like perfection was only good enough, and used to get, I can think of a couple in particular who get so frustrated playing other players who did well competitively, who were nowhere near the same ball strikers as they were.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I work with people all the time like that, who are just obsessed with their ball striking and haven't figured out, in general, the people who are obsessed with ball striking are really poor on the mental game. Really, and often they're poor on putting.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm working with someone now who I've got to be careful of confidentiality, but it's, I won't even tell you the gender, but it's a person who has won multiple USGA amateur events, who hits the average greens in regulation of this person is almost 17.5.
That's ridiculous. That's off the charts.
Yeah. But because this person has suffered off and on for 20 years with severe putting yips, she's still I just revealed the gender. It's a female. She's still +2 something handicap index
Right.
with putting yips. But that's a premier example. Like uh, she just doesn't understand putting. She doesn't think it should be part of golf almost. I mean, it is obviously, but she's just never gotten it. And there are people who are really good ball strikers, including Hogan. Hogan hated putting.
Mm.
And of course, you probably know he ended his competitive career due to a bad case of putting yips.
Didn't he at one point try to put the idea on the table that putting should be worth less than a full shot?
Correct. Yeah, that's right.
Mm.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
Yeah.
Peter
Yeah.
Jacobson, the pro here from Portland, his dad was his parents were members at Waverly Country Club, which is a private club in Portland. And I was talking to his brother, who also used to, well, I think he still is a local teaching club pro. He told me that, and his dad was I think a +1, something like that. He hated putting, so whenever the father and the two sons hit it on the green, they would pick up their balls and walk to the next tee. They wouldn't even putt out. They hated putting so much. Isn't it interesting? Yeah. So the balance thing is a big deal for sure. Yeah, no doubt about it.
Yeah. And I suppose it comes back to that question of why do you do this, and what is it that's really important to you about playing the game of golf? What is your true purpose for doing it?
And that brings in the neuroscience part of it, which is what's called the dopamine reward circuit. So uh, that's the main reason why people do anything that they find inherently interesting, fascinating, pleasurable, is the dopamine reward circuit. And it actually has two main parts to it. The dopamine circuit itself actually isn't the pleasure. That's the endorphin circuit. The dopamine circuit is the desire to do the thing that produces the pleasure, as opposed to the pleasure. So we get the pleasure, the endorphin rush in golf, when we're successful in hitting a high quality shot or birdieing a hole or even eagling a hole. But what drives us to be fascinated by the process of playing the game is the dopamine circuit, which is the desire or the craving or the wanting. And like anything, you can have too much craving, too much desire, too much wanting, which then creates frustration if you're not able to be successful, which can create a negative attachment to the game. Mm. And there's a term for that in psychology called intermittent reinforcement or random reinforcement syndrome, which means when a mammal's brain is addicted to dopamine or the pursuit of pleasure and is frustrated or blocked from actually experiencing a successful outcome, which gives you the endorphin part, they can start to form very irrational decision making. Right. And you see it in gambling addiction. If you go to Las Vegas or Macau and watch someone playing slot machines, and when they do win, they get super, super excited. Mm. And some people actually believe if they go through a little ritual, that the ritual itself creates the successful outcome, yeah. which is conflating luck with skill. Yeah. And we see that conflation of luck with skill particularly among amateur golfers who are not great. So people who are generally sort of like the 12 handicap or higher range, most of those golfers in that range have some degree of addiction to the random reinforcement dynamic, meaning they play golf because they feel really excited when they hit a lucky shot. It's not based on skill. Yeah.
But also, is that not something for people to look at? You mentioned about hitting balls on the range and you genuinely enjoy it, and that's fine. But also, there must be a lot of people who, on the one hand, they want to be competitive and they want to see how far they can go in the game, but get so addicted to the feeling of good shots on the range where that's constantly reinforced, and they end up being in a double bind then, don't they? Where the golf course then, they don't get the same rewards from the shots as they do on the range, and always keep retreating back to the range to try and fix everything.
That's exactly right. That's a very, very, very common phenomenon, particularly among people in the sort of like 0 to 12 handicap range. There's a lot of low handicap players who struggle to take their range swing to the golf course. Mm. And ironically, trying to take your range swing to the golf course is one of the reasons it doesn't transfer over. Because again, it injects too much self-sabotage, too much getting in your own way, too much self-interference. Yeah.
And so would you say for that kind of player that perhaps they need to develop a little bit more or a lot more of the acceptance skill of being able to I've used a model a lot. It was Randy Joyner who first pointed it out to me, and it's so obvious really that whenever you play golf, you've got three types of shots. You've got good shots, good enough, and poor shots. And I think a lot of people don't have a good enough relationship with good enough shots, do they? They don't acknowledge them.
Oh my God, it's absolutely true. I mean, when I do playing lessons, again, particularly with mid to high handicappers, and as soon as they hit their first either good enough or poor shot, they have an emotional meltdown on the golf course. And I'm like, dude, you're a 20 handicap. Why would you expect to hit a good shot, say 90% of the time, when you only actually hit good shots, even on the range where there's no pressure, maybe only 20% of the time? You should. So again, that's all that stuff is based on random reinforcement, which is again the basis of all addictive behavior to some degree, particularly gambling addiction, is the random reinforcement thing. So I always ask my students, you really got to question: are you trying to get lucky out there, or are you trying to build a game that's based on actual skill, both mental game skill and physical skill? And the people I think who have a very healthy relationship with the sport recognize the clear distinction between skill and luck.
Yeah. On that point then, Jim, in terms of developing skill, and I know a lot of people, certainly in the UK where I am, we're going to be faced inevitably in the next few months with some poor weather. Well, in fact, I say we're going to be faced with some poor weather. We've had poor weather for the last 12 months, but that's another story. But one thing's for certain, where I am, the weather's going to decrease in temperature, and we're probably going to get a lot of instances of courses being closed. What's your thoughts on how much can be done in the winter to the benefit of your game indoors?
Well, I always say that if you're going to make a radical swing change, the worst time of year to do it is in the warmer summer season, because by its very nature, making one or more radical swing changes, or even putting or chipping stroke changes, takes time. There's a certain amount of frustration that goes into the process that students need to be aware of. And most people's mental game, particularly their mental focus, isn't strong enough to play really well, or as well as they're capable of, when they're in the midst of doing a radical swing change. I mean, I can tell people what the rules are, but for some reason, human beings find it hard to follow the rules, one of which is don't try to make the swing happen. Don't try to make the swing change happen during the swing itself when you're playing on the golf course. In other words, play with the swing you have that day. Flaws and all. People who are making a radical swing change find it really, really hard to follow that, right? Because they want to get that, again, they want that rush of instant gratification, because they know when they, at least on the range, when their body actually carries out the new change, let's say they hit it like 10 yards further in the air with their driver. So they want that endorphin rush they get from being successful in terms of shot outcomes. So it's very difficult to follow the rules, but nonetheless, I mean, I think when your mental focus and your emotional state control skills get better, it is easier to do that. So basically, ideally, do the swing changes in the winter months, not the summer months.
And what would be the golden rules then? So let's say you've identified some key thing in your swing that you want to change this winter. What would be because as we've talked about before, there's a huge gap between having a conceptual understanding of what you need to change in your golf swing and actually making that to a movement pattern. What would be your golden rules on that in terms of that journey to making any changes?
Well, one of the big ones is all movement pattern changes have to be done without a ball. That's important, because think about it, if you're doing it with a ball and you've already identified a focal point for your mind that tends to create the new movement pattern, and you're doing it with a ball, because of the inherent complexity of the golf swing, where there's multiple variables physically, not to mention mind and emotions, that can affect the ball flight. What most golfers do is they violate this rule, and then the first 3 or 4 really bad shots they hit, they start questioning the validity of the swing change. So in my program, you don't do any of these changes over a golf ball ever. They're all done away from a ball. And the second rule is they're done at slower than normal speeds, because you're Your conscious mind only has precision control over your body when you're attempting to learn a new pattern. Your conscious mind can only do that. You can only make the body do the pattern change when you're moving basically in slow motion.
Yeah.
And that's been something.
Which is, sorry to interrupt you, but that's the heart of martial arts, isn't it? That's been around for thousands of years. They'd worked that out way back.
Yeah, that's literally what I was going to say. You took the words out of my mouth. Yeah. So when I was a kid, lucky for me, I took up golf and martial arts literally at the same age 10. And I tried for the first 9 months in my 10th year I would go down to Chinatown, Japantown, Chicago, and get these karate, their kung fu books that would have pictures. It would be Chinese or Japanese on the left side of the page, and the right side would be English translation. And I tried to learn myself. But I learned even early on from those books that you do all this in slow-mo. You don't do it in the middle of a street fight. You do it in slow-mo, where there's no pressure, where you can focus your mind properly. So yeah, you're right. In the Asian martial arts tradition, it's been a couple thousand years of tradition. You do blocking, punching, and kicking, say in karate, in very, very slow speed in front of a mirror. The mirror gives you the visual feedback. You know, and tour pros know this. Tiger's talked about, he always did all of his movement pattern changes in slow motion in front of a mirror. Hogan talked about spending an hour or two every night in the hotel room mirror doing slow motion work. So that's the way to do it, although that is not common knowledge among most golfers, that's how you make changes. Yeah.
No. The common theme is that you watch something on YouTube and you get a video, you send it to somebody, and it instantly changes as a result of being given information.
I know. No, that's such a good point you're making. I mean, and this is because we were talking for the audience listening. Karl and I were talking before we started recording about you know, some of the kind of failed strategies that people indulge in, and that's one of them. That there's this ethos or this worldview in traditional golf teaching that it's simply, you just need to know intellectually what you're doing wrong, and somehow having that knowledge will fix it. Are you kidding me? Anybody who teaches golf for a living knows that is total BS. That's not how it works. I work with people all the time who are highly intelligent people. They've seen their swing on video. They've been to other instructors who've analyzed their swing on video. They know exactly what they're doing wrong, and they cannot stop doing it.
Yeah.
You know, that's the emperor has no clothes thing in traditional golf teaching. No one wants to talk about that.
No.
Right.
No.
Intellectual information is just the starting point. It's just the first step of 1,000 steps. The other 999 steps are about the application part, not
the lowest rung of the ladder. It's the lowest rung of the ladder, isn't it? The intellectual understanding of it.
That's
so once you've started with the slow motion swings in front of the mirror without the ball, then would that evolve into maybe hitting some shots with airflow balls or softball? What's the progression from there then?
Yeah, so you basically what you're doing, and if we divide it into two halves. In the first half of a radical swing change process, again, slow motion away from a ball in a mirror or with some type of actual feedback. Could be a training aid that forces you to do the movement pattern, or a training aid that tells you when you fail to do it.
Yeah.
It could be still using your phone video camera to get some actual objective evidence. What am I actually doing with my body and club? But then in the second half, you're introducing faster speed, still not full, but more like half speed. Greg Norman used to talk about, once he did that first half of slow motion mirror work, he would go to the range for hours and hit balls at half speed.
Yeah.
And what you're focusing the mind on, remember, you have to have a focal point for everything you do, you know, for your mind, for your awareness. You're focusing on the memory and feel or kinesthetic channel for what the change feels like. So now you've graduated from the mirror. You don't need to get external visual channel feedback. That's what the mirror does. You're at the level now where if you hold on to the memory, a kinesthetic memory of the sensation in your body when your body does the change, you're hoping that when you hold on to the memory, your subconscious mind gets the message, accepts the message, and then creates the actual movement pattern change. But the reason why that issue is seldom discussed, I think accurately, is because there's a common conflation in the population, at least among people who don't do some type of daily mindfulness practice. There's a conflation between a memory, a field channel memory of a past event, and what's happening right now. And that's a big deal in my teaching practice.
Mm.
We could do a quick exercise for it to make the conflation more obvious if you want.
Yeah, please do, Jim. That'd be great.
All right, so close your eyes and then take your index finger and tap your shoulder and keep tapping. And so what I would tell you, Karl, is this is a real event. It's not happening in the past. It's happening right now in the present moment. So for the listeners, Karl's tapping shoulder with his index finger. He can feel that. Yeah. Now, in a few seconds, I'm going to ask Karl to stop tapping. And for a short period of time, Karl, it'll feel like it's still happening, even though it's not happening. It's a memory, right? Stop. Yeah.
Yeah.
Then tell me when the memory goes away completely.
Yeah, it's starting to fade.
Yeah, yeah. For most people, it fades after about 2 to 3 seconds. But for that 2 to 3 seconds, it kind of feels like you're still tapping.
Still doing it. Yeah.
So what I tell people, look, in the second half of the radical swing change process, you need to do lots of swings, mainly at half speed. You're not going to get much benefit from slow-mo during the second half of the process. And a lot of that can be done with your eyes closed and feel, because closing your eyes puts you more in the internal feel as opposed to external visual. And remember, when I do the swing change, what does it feel like? Well, it feels like X. And what does the old swing pattern, the bad one, feel like? Well, that feels like Y. So you do Y on purpose, do the old pattern on purpose. What does that feel like? Do the new pattern X on purpose. What does that feel like? Sense the distinction. And then hold on to the memory of X during the swing. Yes. And you hope that holding on to the memory will trigger the change. Now, in my experience, for the mid to high handicappers, even when there's no ball involved like this, about 50% of the time or more often, the body, in the early stages of doing this, the body fails to execute. It does not get the message.
Yeah.
For really good players, really top amateurs or tour pros I work with, they get holding on to the memory will trigger the new pattern about 75% of the time without a ball, right? And about maybe a little bit less than that, 50% of the time on the range, and even less than that on the golf course under competitive pressure. So even tour pros struggle to take this change to the golf course in a tournament, and they're masters at focusing their mind and feel.
Yeah.
Right. So it doesn't have that good of a track. That's why I tell people you have to be patient. Don't expect for it to show up on the golf course. It might take 3 or 4 more months of practice before it shows up ever on the golf course. Yeah.
So I suppose within that as well, Jim, you need to be really clear again with your coach why you're actually doing this. And surely that should always refer back to what you're eventually trying to do with the golf ball. Surely these changes should always be linked to you trying to hit the golf ball in a certain way.
Yeah. So any swing change has to be based on what is the desired ball flight change. You know, lower trajectory, higher trajectory, curving it left to right, curving it right to left, whatever it is. That's the starting point. And then you work backwards from there. Then what does the club have to do? And then you work backwards from there. What does my body have to do to move the club? And then you go backwards again. What does my mind have to do? Which gets into what we've been talking about, the learning and the practice process. And, you know, the problem is we're still kind of in the dark ages in the golf instruction business. Not so much in terms of the physical body, laws of body motion, laws of club motion. That's pretty much figured out. There's pretty much a consensus on the major points of those two things today. What there's almost no consensus on are what are the rules for how to practice and how to learn effectively.
No,
it's almost like people don't know.
It's almost never talked about. Is
never
it?
Talked about.
There's no videos come up, as far as I'm aware. There's not many videos come up on YouTube that work on this swing change, but these are the rules of how you're actually going to go about making those swing changes.
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir, man. I totally get it. This is the thing I've been saying, and I've done PGA education seminars on this, and a lot of times it just goes in one ear out there. People in general we're still in the dark ages on the psychological side of the game. I think it's an inconvenient truth, isn't it? Yes, it is. Yeah, because it means you have to radically change how you teach. You can't know that information, which science knows to be true. You know, the science of motor learning. You can get a PhD in motor learning. And there are coaches in other sports who have been employing this knowledge for the last 30, 40 years, but it just hasn't trickled down to the sort of the average lessonee in golf instruction yet, right? Does it then also, just playing devil's advocate on that, Jim, does it then, being realistic about what's required to make swing changes,
does it then beg the question that for an awful lot of people, they would be far better to look at other areas of getting the best out of what they currently
Yes.
have?
Yeah. No, for sure. Yeah, it's a brilliant point. Yeah, again, I mean, if you're the type of golfer who, for whatever reason, doesn't have the time to practice, to make a change, which is one of the first questions I ask a new student, do you have X amount of time? Let's say in my system, it's 20 minutes, 6 days a week, say Monday through Saturday, take Sunday off, 20 minutes of home practice and an hour and a half on the driving range, right? Because there are some things you need to work on the range. What Hogan called dynamic practice versus mechanical practice. So Hogan practiced mechanics, the movement pattern stuff, away from the ball, no exceptions. But he practiced dynamics on the range, which is balance, tempo, rhythm, release timing, working on your focal points and how you use your mind on the golf course. You can practice the focal point training on the range. You should. And a few other things, mainly if you're trying to curve the ball right or left, that's what the range is for. But the range is not for wrist mechanics, shoulder turn, pivot mechanics, arm swing mechanics. That should be done, again, away from a ball at slower than normal speeds. Yeah.
And you mentioned there, we touched on it before, but I think it'd be good to recap on it about focal point. And my interpretation is that the sort of holy grail is to be able to find something to focus on for the entire duration of your golf swing and to stay with that.
Correct.
Which sounds incredibly simple in a second's activity, but as we know, and I've said it many times, that the golf swing is an eternity for the mind, isn't it?
It really is. Yeah. Well, when you think of that, your mind, your internal visual channel can see roughly 10 distinct different visual images per second. And your auditory channel can hear syllables or single syllable words in 4 to 7 individual syllables per second. And your kinesthetic channel can process precise, like you're tapping. If you could have tapped your shoulder 20 times, you probably can't do it that fast. But if you could feel 20 distinct physical sensations, right? So there's a time limit to how the mind can work. And the problem is, again, if you think of just the visual, so you could have the golf swing from the moment of takeaway to impact, not to finish, is roughly 1 second.
Yeah.
You could have 10 visual thoughts in that 1 second.
Yeah.
Back to your idea of a big, yeah. And of course, anytime you lose your original focal point, somewhere in your body, a muscle will tend to tighten up or flinch. Meaning that's an example of the mind-body connection being disrupted. So when your mind loses focus, there's an immediate loss of mind-body connection. Yeah.
And again, as I understand it, in my experiences, there's a big difference between a kind of observational focus point as opposed to trying to tell your muscles what to do.
Correct. Right. Yeah. Telling your muscles what to do, again, should only be done without a ball at slower speeds. As soon as you're moving at normal tempo, you need to be in either observational mode, what I call passive awareness.
Yeah.
Or again, if you're a much better player, like we talked about a minute ago, and you're going to use holding on to the memory and feel channel of the swing change, that's active awareness. But again, that's why I mentioned it for a reason. Even tour pros struggle to take that to the golf course. So that's almost exclusively for amateurs, something you would do in the later stages of a swing change process on the range at full speed. You would decide, I'm going to hold on to the memory, what it feels like, and then hope I hit a good shot, and maybe maybe tape yourself every 10th swing or something to see if your body's actually got the message, right? So the point you're making is a good one. For the listeners listening, you need to be much more in passive mode in a golf shot.
Yeah. And what would be a good example of that, Jim? Just give a practical example of what perhaps somebody would observe during the swing that would hold their attention.
Well, there's any number of in my system, there's 5 categories of focal points. So, but since we're talking about body categories so far in this conversation, let's stay with that. So you can focus on any body part, any sensation, in a passive mode. So one I use a lot, particularly with, as you know, I work with a lot of golfers with yips. The most commonly reported best focal point for people with short game yips and putting yips is to focus on the sensations coming from the bottom of their lead foot. So for a right-handed golfer, you would shine the light of your focused attention ability on the sensations coming from the bottom of your left foot. a second or two before you start your takeaway, you would keep your mind on the sensations coming from the bottom of your foot all the way to the finish of the swing or the stroke. And you simply notice the sensations.
Yes.
You're not trying to do anything. You're literally like a scientist looking through a microscope. You're passively observing with some degree of what we call meta awareness, right? Which means non-judgmental awareness, or the mind is observing its own functioning in the moment objectively.
So presumably for the person with the yips, as they put their attention on that lead foot and they become absorbed with observing that, the conscious mind is then occupied by that, which then allows the subconscious activity of making the putt or the chip can then flow.
Yeah, brilliantly stated. That's right. So when you focus your mind properly on a focal point, that's one of the nice side benefits is it prevents self-sabotage. So your conscious mind is basically being distracted by whatever the focal point is. So your unconscious mind can communicate its blueprint for the swing or the stroke to your muscles and joints. Yeah. That's how it works.
Yeah. And again, I think just to recap on this with the yips that we've talked about before, but I think again, it's so important. At the heart of all of this, in terms of getting the other side of these issues, the base of all of it, as I understand it, is acceptance, isn't it? Is a willingness to accept the variety of outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we could do 10 podcasts on acceptance. It's so important. You know, a new YIP student asked me about 2 weeks ago, because he knew about 50% of the source material in my YIPS Cure program is basically classical Buddhist philosophy and mindfulness or psychological practice. And that he said to me, well, is there one overarching principle in Buddhist philosophy? And I go, yeah, there is. And I said, great question. I don't get that very often. It's Buddhism, the Buddhist approach to mindfulness practice, the Buddhist approach to trying to become a better, more highly functional human being. One of the overarching starting sort of foundational principles is, well, there's two things. One is something is happening right now. There's a reality to the present moment. And that applies to both your internal psychological world, if that's what you're paying attention to, and it applies to the physical, external material world. Something's happening objectively. And your job is to be aware of what that something is, number one. And number two, with total acceptance, no resistance, right? And, and again, in Buddhist philosophy, it wasn't meant to be an organized religion, which it eventually evolved into after the Buddha died. It was meant to be the world's first system for psychotherapy. Yeah. So first you have to acknowledge the reality of the present moment, even if it's causing you some type of psychological or even physical pain, right? And then you have to accept it with an open mind and an open heart, no resistance. And out of that acceptance, your ability to become more meta aware of what the nature of the suffering, the nature of the problem, or the nature of the suffering that's happening to you is. The riddle of the suffering is the answer, the solution to the problem lies within the problem itself. But when you accept it with no resistance, you can, because you shift into a higher gear of awareness, we call meta, you can instantly see, oh, there's a resolution. There's a solution to my suffering. If I do X, I can solve the problem.
You're right.
But when you resist the initial stages of suffering or psychological pain, it's like you're lost in the wilderness. Because, I live up in the wilderness, up in the mountains. My son was a wilderness ranger when he was in high school. The first thing they teach you is when you're lost, don't run around trying to find your way out.
No.
Calm down, sit on a rock, get your bearings. If you have a map, try to figure out where you are. Look for the nearest source of a river or a creek. They always flow downhill. Follow, but you're supposed to stay still for 30 minutes and don't panic. So that's the idea of acceptance. When you can accept the reality of the moment without resistance, the answer will appear automatically, spontaneously, which very few people understand how that works, but it's correct.
As you say, that acceptance as an intellectual concept can be everybody. Not everybody, but 99% of people will accept it intellectually as a great thing to look at. Right. But there's so many layers beneath that intellectual understanding, isn't there? And,
sure.
And as you said, Jim, that somebody else on the podcast said all of human suffering comes from either craving or resistance. We're either craving of something in the future that hasn't happened yet, or we're resisting what is going on right now. And then when you bring it right back to an individual putt or a chip, it's the resistance that to the outcome that actually stops you being curious about what is creating that, isn't it?
There you go. That's right. And that was one of the things, you know, I'm a self-taught golfer. Hogan was a self-taught golfer. People who are self-taught golfers in general, in my experience, they tend to play better golf more consistently. They hold up under pressure better. Because they're self-taught, they relied on their light bulb moments, their meta-aware moments to create change in understanding the mental game, the putting game, short game, long game. But when you're not relying on yourself and you're relying on a teacher or a book or a video, again, all that stuff, the teacher, the book, and the video, they're just getting you headed in what I call the general direction of correct or north. It doesn't get you in the ballpark. Theory doesn't get you in the ballpark. Application gets you in the ballpark, right? And one of the foundational principles of the application part, the process part, is like you mentioned, acceptance with no resistance. But a lot of people fail to achieve that first step because in the early stages of acceptance, the psychological or even the physical pain can get worse in the short term.
Yes.
And so particularly in the psychological side of things, it can be very hard on your ego to realize, you know, I'm not really as good a ball striker as I thought I was. I was kind of deceiving myself in the past. Now I'm really realizing, the more I work with my coach, the more I look at my swing on video, I realize, man, I'm really not that good at this. And so cutting through that layer of denial and self-deception is a big part of that first step, you know?
And I think one of the things that people find really hard, Jim, with acceptance is that they conflate acceptance with resignation. It's almost as though if I accept poor shots, I'm not trying, or I'm not trying to be the best. And it's so diametrically opposed to that, isn't it? Acceptance is a very active component of excellence.
Correct. Yeah, not the same thing as resignation at all. Yeah. You're accepting the reality of the present moment. That doesn't mean whatever the reality present moment is going to be the reality a month from now. But people often will do that, right? They'll project into the future what's happening now, which gets back to one of the original points, which is to be psychologically healthy, whether you're a golfer or a non-golfer, you need to spend a lot of your time focusing whatever you're focusing on in the present moment.
Yeah.
Right. Neurotic people spend very little time dealing with the present moment. People who are neurotic, who often end up in therapy because of their neurosis, will spend the majority of their time when they don't have to focus for, say, work. When they have some free moments, if they have a couple of hours of free time, they'll generally go internal and they'll start thinking about either pleasurable or painful memories from the past, or they'll project into the future, either pleasurable things they hope will happen in the future or fear of something bad happening in the future. And so the mind kind of pings back and forth between past and future and avoids staying in the present. You know?
Yeah. Was it Blaise Pascal who said all of man's ills stem from his inability to sit quietly on his own in a room?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So on this then, Jim, from the mental game side of things, what would be some thoughts that you could have if you're going to look at developing some of these ideas through the what are some practical things that you could be doing when you can't go and play golf?
Yeah, I think all human beings should do some form of daily, at least, again, you could take Sundays off, but at least 6 days a week, do some type of mindfulness practice. Because if you're not doing a daily mindfulness practice, then really all you're doing is you're engaging in philosophical debate on the mental game, which is sort of equivalent to medieval Catholic theologians debating how many angels you can fit on the head of a pin. It just becomes speculative philosophical BS, basically. At some point, you have to drop the philosophical speculation and say, what do I need to do to have better control over my conscious mind? How do I acquire the skill of focused awareness? How do I develop meta awareness? Because those are the tools that allow you to apply these lofty philosophical principles to actual, kind of a very pragmatic nuts and bolts, concrete form. So you can start to hit better golf shots, play better golf, shoot lower scores. You have to find a way of exerting a higher degree of agency or autonomy or personal power over your conscious mind. And that's what some form of meditation practice gives you. Yeah.
But and surely within that though is the understanding that we don't have control over what we're going to think next. We can't totally control what we're going to think next or in any way, but we can then think deliberately about the task in front of us if it's a golf shot.
That's right. Well, the Buddhist understanding of consciousness which is quite sophisticated. In fact, I've always said that they're the world's original neuro or cognitive scientists, and they've been practicing cognitive science for 2,500 years. But one of the big overarching principles in Buddhism is you need to form a distinction between focused attention and whatever you're focusing on. In other words, your ability to focus your attention is not the same thing as the focal point. So if you think of focused attention as a flashlight beam or a torch beam, a beam of light, you can switch from object A, focusing on A, to B, to C. So where the light shines is not the same thing as the light. The light itself is separate from whatever it's focusing on, right? That's whereas in normal consciousness that hasn't been trained with some type of mindfulness practice, there's a conflation that your consciousness is the same thing as what you're paying attention to. And when you're in that type of consciousness, to use another Buddhist analogy, that your mind, your internal private subjective psychological space is sort of like a river. And to develop the ability to float downstream in the river without drowning, we'll call drowning a form of intense form of psychological suffering. You have to find a way to basically be a better swimmer. In the early stages of mindfulness practice allows you to keep your head above water when you're going down the class 3 rapids in the river of your internal psychological state. And eventually to actually climb up on the banks of the river and sit on the riverbank and watch the thoughts, the memories, the emotions go by without any attachment. That's the meta part, right? So that, in other words, there is a process for how to do this that you could go through, but you have to start somewhere. So the question is, if you're drowning in the river, which is normal consciousness, you're having trouble breathing because the waves are powerful and you're not a good swimmer. You have to start somewhere. So you learn some basic elements of how to keep your head above water. And in the Buddhist tradition, that's called samatha, or narrow focus, or more in English, concentration practice. So to create a little bit of psychological stability in this churning mass of internal thoughts, emotions, judgments, worries, fears, you have to start somewhere. And that means you start on organizing your focused attention in extremely narrow mode on just one thing. And so my system, that one thing, the first practice is called candle flame concentration. So you light a candle, you sit in a sort of semi-dark room by yourself where you won't be disturbed, set your phone alarm for 2 minutes, and you look at the candle flame with external visual channel hopefully without having any internal reaction to the flame. And of course, what typically happens to most people when they first do it, after about 10 seconds of doing it properly, just staying on the candle flame, they go internal and they go, is this really going to help me play better golf? And as soon as you hear that voice, you're no longer paying attention to the candle, right? So the whole idea is, how do you stay external? That's the starting point, is to stay external.
Yeah. And I think a great potential exploration is walking meditation, isn't it? It's just being out in nature, and whether it's tuning into the feeling of your feet or sights and sounds around you. I think these are all just potential areas that people can look at that are only beneficial, really.
Yeah, walking meditation is the second exercise in my program, where you look at an object during your daily walk. You got to be by yourself, can't do it with a dog. The dog will be too distracted. And you look at an object, doesn't matter what it is, for 2 to 3 seconds max. And you notice, because you're external, you're noticing the size, color, and the shape. Now, noticing doesn't mean going internal and giving a name to it. So, for example, if I walk out my front door and there's a red Corvette Stingray, I can stay external visual and notice that it's a red car. I don't have to go internal and say, oh, it's a red Corvette Stingray with the voice channel, with the auditory channel. I can simply stay external in my eyeballs. So if you ask me later, I'll be able to remember what the objects were in the order that I perceived them. Because there's a correlation between focused attention and memory. People who have good memories tend to stay in the present moment. They tend to have highly focused attention skill, and because of that, they could easily remember what they were focusing on. Yeah,
Yeah.
they can recall it. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the second version of walking meditation.
Yeah. Jim, I think we've got the submarine out tonight, and we dived deep there, didn't we? With a few areas, but we always do, and that's a fascinating, been a fascinating conversation as ever. What would your overall message be for folk listening in terms of the winter time and looking at the game? I know we've covered a lot tonight, but what would be this sort of overarching message that you would leave people with?
I think it's just that the game is inherently extremely difficult. Accepting that it's a difficult sport and kind of lower your expectations in terms of the timeline. The more pressure you put on yourself to make the changes or to shoot lower scores, ironically, that actually causes a delay in shooting lower scores or hitting quality golf shots. So that acceptance of the inherent difficulty of what you're trying to do, I would say that would be a good discussion to have with yourself. And of course, the second one would be identify if you're mainly a competitor, a learner, or a shot maker, and then come up with a plan and work on some stuff over the winter. That's basically stuff that when spring arrives, you'll have at least some semblance of a skill already have attained.
And I think it ties in with something I kept suggesting. Is just see it as a wonderful path, a path of mastery. You're never going to get there. You're never going to finish. But if the path's got a heart to it, you're able to stay on it despite whatever outcomes you may have at any given time.
Another brilliant one from Karl. Have you read the Castaneda books about Don Juan? You know what I'm talking about?
No.
Okay. Well, Carlos Castaneda, he's gone now, but back in the late 60s, I think it was 67, he was getting his master's from UCLA in anthropology. And he met a Native American, Mexican, Yaqui Indian shaman whose name was Don Juan Matus. Right. And Carlos Castaneda wrote, I think, 8 books about his interactions with Don Juan and some of his fellow medicine men and women or shamans, brujos is a Spanish term, in Mexico. And that's one of the big principles in that teaching, that shamanistic approach to mindfulness practice, was that you want to follow a path with heart. Yeah. That's why I asked you when you said that. It kind of blew my mind. I haven't thought about that in probably 2 decades. But yeah, his whole thing was, if you're going to, whatever path you're going to choose in life, or in this case in golf, choose a path with heart. Don't choose a path that lacks heart, because otherwise you're just going to get burnt out because of the difficulty. There has to be some joyful or positive, emotionally positive aspect of your pursuit of mastery, so that when you do fail, you're still not going to be, you'll be able to accept the failure and keep some positive emotional momentum going forward, right?
And I think a path with a heart, whatever it is, Jim, whether it's golf, cookery, surgery, whatever it is, it resonates at a very deep level then, doesn't it? If there's a genuine reason for being on that path,
that's right,
you're far more likely to stay on it. And I think the modern world is doing everything probably to take us off those paths, isn't it? With instant gratification. Yeah.
So path with heart basically means, it doesn't mean that what you're pursuing isn't inherently difficult, because again, if it was easy, why would you do it? So I always joke, there's a point in time as a kid when you stop playing tic-tac-toe, because you always tie with your friend because it's inherently too easy. And then you play checkers, and then after a while, maybe there's a sort of stalemate and then you take up chess, right? So golf is like chess times like 100. It's like really, really, really difficult. And the best players in the world, and a lot of whom I've talked to and you've talked to, they know this. They think, Scotty Scheffler thinks golf is hard. Yeah. So imagine if it's hard for Scotty Scheffler, what it should be like. So a path with heart would mean accepting the insane level of difficulty of the game of golf that you've chosen as your primary hobby, which means you can't be primarily playing it only for low scores and high quality golf shots. There has to be some other reason that you're playing, right? For a path of heart.
I think a path with heart's a great place to conclude there, Jim. That's a fantastic message for everybody to leave with. We're going to over the winter months, we're going to do a a webinar together, which will get the dates organized for that. And
Yeah,
for folks listening, I'm sure there'll be a lot of people interested, the chance to sit in on a webinar with us and maybe ask some questions at the end of it. But for anybody listening who wants to get in touch with you, I know you bombed out with clients with the yips and having great success with that. But where can people find you who haven't
sure.
looked you up so far?
Easy. Yeah, easy to find at balancepointgolf.com. We have a pretty cool website. It's all the yips program. We do a online remote yips program, which is 10.5 hours of instruction spaced out over about 5 months. It has a 92% success rate for curing the yips of any type of golf shot or other athletes from other sports as well. So it's all there. Yeah, this has been fun, Karl. I'm looking forward to doing the webinar with you. It'll be really cool, I think.
As ever, we throw the ball up in the air. We don't know where it's going to land, but it seems to do okay. But Jim, as ever, thanks ever so much for your time. I always appreciate chatting with you. It's always a great experience.
Likewise.